Congratulations on advancing another week into the fantasy football playoffs. Here are all the players that we can add and stash off of our waiver wire to guarantee ourselves some success this week and the next coming, as well as some security, which is much needed for that flex spot. Make sure to stick around to the end of the video as well, because I will go over my top defenses that we can stash for the next 2 weeks of the playoffs. They are available and they are going to get you a lot of points. If you do enjoy this video, make sure to go down and hit that like button if you are feeling generous. It helps me out a ton and this channel as well. But I will never waste your time. The first stash that we need to be making here as soon as possible is going to be Brenton Strange. I do not care if you don't need a tight end, if your league is too shallow, it doesn't matter. He is a top guy that you need to be adding today. He can be started as early as today. First things first, Evan Ingram does go out for the year with a shoulder injury. He didn't play in week 15. Now he's not going to play for the rest of the year, putting Brenton Strange as the number 1 tight end. We saw that last week. He finished with 11 receptions for 73 yards. That's good for a 27.9 target share. That is absolutely insane. Obviously behind Brian Thomas Jr., but keep in mind, this was against one of the better defenses in the Jets at stopping fantasy points to the tight end position. So the Jaguars offensive scheme, it looks good and they use their tight ends a lot. It's just the way that they run their offense, regardless of what quarterback it is. The tight end position in this offense is targeted just under 10 times a game on average, and we can look back very recently to see the kind of success that Brenton Strange has had. In weeks 2 through 9, he was the tight end 9 overall, and that was coming with tough matchups against the Bills and against the Texans. Well, this week the Jags get a really easy one against the Raiders, which is extremely positive to tight end points allowed. They are 4th overall in that aspect, allowing over 13 fantasy points a game, even if you don't need a tight end. Again, this is a spot where we can add him, or you can hold him away from your league mates if they would be starting him regardless. He's one of the best waiver adds, barely rostered in your fantasy football league, but if you can't get your hands on him and you need another guy to put at that flex spot, I promise you, Cedric Tillman is going to be that guy. His roster percentage has been falling dramatically ever since that concussion that he suffered about 3-4 weeks ago. He hasn't played since then, so it's kind of taken him out of the news. His roster percentage has been dropping. If we look at him and we look at these matchups more importantly, that should not be happening. They get the Cincinnati Bengals this week, which is by far the best one you could possibly get if your name is Jameis Winston. Last week, the Bengals let the Titans go for 27 on them. They let the Cowboys go for 20. The Steelers go for 44. Over their last 5 games, they're allowing 32 points a game to opposing offenses and 28 on the entire season. So they've been a liability the entire time. When you look at who exactly would be matched up against Cedric Tillman, you have Cam Taylor-Britt, you have Josh Newton, 2 guys allowing over 0.35 fantasy points per route run this year. That is extremely positive for anybody else wondering. Top corners, top guys like Patrick Surtain, Marshawn Lattimore, they're averaging less than 0.2 fantasy points allowed to opposing wide receivers. So that's really, really good on that aspect. They also allow a very high combined passer rating to opposing quarterbacks, and I wouldn't be surprised if we get Jameis Winston in this matchup throwing for over 55 passing attempts. Again, that's a green light for Cedric Tillman, Jerry Jeudy, anybody else in this offense. We don't have David Njoku due to injury. He could possibly come back this week, but still, all of that with the matchup and the defensive liability that the Bengals are, Jameis Winston is going to pass. Now, he had a bad game last week. He had 46 yards against the Chiefs, 0 touchdowns, 3 interceptions. All things considered, that's one of the better defenses in the NFL. He's going to have those down games. The pass volume was relatively there, still lower than average. But again, with that down game, he's still averaging 40 passing attempts a game as a starter in this year. As well as being the number 1 team in total pass volume, this has led Tillman to be the number 1 wide receiver in targets per game and target share when he was healthy since becoming the starter in week 7. He's averaging 10 targets a game. You can suggest with Tillman back in this offense, maybe the offense is going to move a little bit easier. They're going to move the chains, get first downs, and give him more fantasy points as well as just being a more dynamic offense. So that's going to be an absolutely amazing situation. Cedric Tillman is a plug, play, and stash we need to be going through for the rest of the fantasy football weeks. But if you want to get a little bit deeper into the bag of fantasy football stashes, Jalen McMillan can be a guy for you here. I see him as one of the more risky options on this list, but still viable. His last 2 weeks have been absolutely insane and proven that maybe he's not as much of a risk as we think. He put up 21.9 fantasy points against the Raiders, then 19.5 against the tougher Chargers defense last week. Now, we do have to look at all sides of this situation. He scored 3 touchdowns in the last 2 weeks, so obviously those fantasy points are going to be close to the 20s. But when you combine his last 2 week stats, that's 9 receptions on 13 targets on 134 receiving yards. That's still a good stretch, touchdowns or not. But what's really amazing about this situation is that Baker Mayfield's pass volume really has not changed whatsoever. So maybe it's not a fluke, it's more of a rookie improvement. Over those last 2 weeks when McMillan put up those numbers, Baker Mayfield had 29 and 27 passing attempts. That's actually on the lower side for NFL standards. Now, we have Mike Evans in this offense. He's obviously going to be the number 1, take the majority of the coverage. That is what's important. He's going to take the number 1 corner every single week regardless of what happens, and that's going to leave Jalen McMillan to run around in the slot and get a whole bunch of targets, which he has seen, and probably a reason why he's increasing his snaps snaps because of that. He's right behind Mike Evans in routes run per game and snap share per game as well ever since those last 3 weeks. If you isolate those specifically, it's a great spot. He gets positive matchups here against the Cowboys this week, then the Panthers in week 17. He could make some noise and possibly be a slot guy you can add as a little bit more of a risk, but a fill-in nonetheless. But another wide receiver here that is absolutely going to be stashed on your roster, I don't care how deep your league is, nobody is talking about him, is going to be Hollywood Brown. Now, I know we haven't heard this name in absolutely forever. He's set to make his NFL return against the Texans in week 16. Now, he's been fully cleared by all doctors. He looks healthy. He practiced with the team on Friday. According to reporters, he looks quick, he looks healthy, and he looks very impressive. So much so that he has a chance of playing in week 16 against the Texans, which, by the way, is an extremely positive matchup here. They allow the 5th most points to opposing wide receivers, the 3rd most points to opposing slot wide receivers. That's probably where he's going to get a majority of his usage and time on field. Now, if he does come back in this time frame, we do have to understand he's probably going to be worked back in with a snap count and eventually be on the field a regular amount for what his standards are. But we have to look at this wide receiver injury here. It was a shoulder injury. A lot of these kinds of upper body injuries for wide receivers, they don't need to take a whole bunch of weeks, 3-4 weeks to get acclimated to an offense. It's usually leg injuries and lower body injuries where you see that kind of thing happen. So he's not going to put up crazy numbers in his first week back. It's a positive matchup. We do need to be adding him. He's a great stash. He was very high in drafts before the injury in preseason for a reason. He's talented. We know this. And he does get very positive matchups again against the Texans and then followed by the Steelers in week 17. Keep an eye on him if you do need an extra roster spot. But we're going to go through and add another guy. If you were in an extreme deep league, there's no other options for you. Dyami Brown is one of these guys from the Washington Commanders that it might be seen as a little bit more of a dart throw, but we don't have Zach Ertz in this offense. He's out with a concussion. Likely he's not going to play in this week 16 matchup, and we have Noah Brown on IR as well. So those top 2 options for Jaden Daniels outside of Terry McLaurin are not going to be in this offense this week, and he's going to have to look for some other guys to step up in that situation. Dyami Brown has been the guy to increase his snaps and also his involvement. If you look, since being drafted in 2021, he really hasn't made a huge name for himself. He hasn't been insanely consistent, but one thing that he does do very, very well is make big plays, and he gets used all over the field. He's averaging 10.3 yards per catch this year, and if you include his entire career statistics in those 4 years, at 16.7. So he's a big play guy. He gets used downfield, which could be the reason why you're going to be putting him in your flex spots. It's also the reason why Nick Westbrook-Akine is a guy that everybody likes. These types of guys don't need an insane target share to be kind of that flyaway guy that we can start on our rosters in these good matchups. So now with all these injuries, Dyami Brown is the number 2 wide receiver on this team. He's number 2 in snaps on this team behind Terry McLaurin. He did finish with 6 fantasy points last week, nothing crazy, only on 4 targets, but with over 30 passing attempts a game on average for Jaden Daniels, they all can't go to Terry McLaurin. Ben Sinnott, he's the backup tight end. He's probably going to get a majority of the snaps here, but they also have John Bates splitting the time and being a great blocking tight end. I don't expect him to just come out of nowhere. He's going to be a little bit more developmental. Zacchaeus is another wide receiver option that can have value, but they come into a tougher matchup here against the Eagles where they're going to need that dynamic play. Then they get the Falcons, a really positive pass first matchup for these wide receivers to finish out the year. Yes, he's a little bit more boom bust, but if you need that lower roster percentage guy that does have high potential, Dyami Brown is going to be that for you. But Will Dissly at the tight end position, or even at the flex position if you're going to need him, is one that we need to be stashing for this week and for week 17 as well. The Chargers, they use their tight ends. That's one thing that they do. Dissly did miss last week with a shoulder injury. He's come back in week 16, likely going to be playing. It's not ruled in, but he comes into a positive matchup against the Broncos. They are top 10 in fantasy points allowed to that position, and Stone Smart can also be an add if he does end up playing in place of Will Dissly again. He had 5 receptions for 50 yards last week. He's talented. He can do it. And the thing with these tight ends for the Chargers, they don't have to worry about splitting snaps. They run a 1 tight end system. It's just always what they've been doing for the entirety of the season. And they get some very positive passing matchups here against the Broncos and the Patriots in their next 2 weeks. They're fighting to make the playoffs. Justin Herbert's pass volume has also been increased from the beginning of the year. There's enough opportunity to go around. They have Quentin Johnson to take the top off defenses, make that coverage change a little bit. He's not a huge target guy either, which allows Dissly to work in that short game, which is why he's been somewhat successful so far this year. But here's the list of promised defenses that we can go through and stash. The list is getting a little bit shorter at this point in the season. A lot of people have already rostered the top defenses, but there's still a lot of good ones that are out there for you. The Colts are going to be that number 1 best option here. Surprisingly, they put up 7 fantasy points against a very good, what was supposed to be a negative matchup against the Broncos. They performed. Now they're coming into an even better matchup here against the Titans, who just finished with 89 total passing yards, 0 touchdowns from Will Levis, along with 3 interceptions. Will Levis is one of the most interception-prone quarterbacks in the entire NFL, also the most meme-prone, but that doesn't necessarily turn into fantasy points. It's a great matchup nonetheless. And then they get the Giants in the fantasy football championship game. That's a great one as well, regardless of who that quarterback is going to be. If you want a bit more of a bougie defense here, one that's rostered in a bit more percentage of leagues, maybe your league is not as serious, or maybe it's just not as many people in it, the Bills is going to be that answer for you. Because they were dropped in a ton of leagues coming into last week's matchup against the Lions, you don't want to be starting any defense against the Lions. It's just how it works, so they could be out there for you. Now they get 2 very positive matchups coming here against the Patriots and the Jets, 2 defense against the Patriots and the Jets, 2 offenses that throw a good amount of interceptions. And speaking of that, this defense is also top 10 in interceptions forced themselves, total fantasy points scored on the year as well, and this is just a great situation. They are left on your waiver wire. They do need to be a top option for you. If you can't get your hands on them, which is understandable, the Packers is going to be another option. They get the Saints and the Vikings in their next 2, and they just managed to drop 15 fantasy points on the Seahawks, despite that offense being pretty good, on the better side, above average. So this week, they get the Saints, no quarterback, probably no Alvin Kamara. They already don't have Taysom Hill. Who knows what is going to be going on with this offense and the efficiency. They're averaging 15.6 points per game over their last 3 games. It's not necessarily one you have to worry about the offense being amazing. And the Packers themselves have one of the better internal units in the NFL. They're good in sacks, they're good in pressure rate, and they play good in the cold, which is going to be good for a little bit of extra boost. They're playing for something. They're in the playoffs. That's also going to give this defense a boost. But that is going to finish off this video. Thank you guys so much for watching. I will see you in the defensive video coming tomorrow, as well as the kicker rankings. Make sure to not miss that. All glory to the man above.